Hello, and welcome to a Cloud Developer channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Azure App Configuration and how you can use that with your Azure Functions. So let's start off by looking at the documentation real quick and going over what is Azure App Configuration. And basically, it is a SaaS offering that is provided by Microsoft in Azure, and it is a fully managed offering that you can get up and running in a matter of minutes. Also, it allows you to centrally manage the configuration of your different functions and your app services instead of having to hardcode those settings in app settings files or anywhere in files that you have to either modify directly in the app service itself or have to redeploy the code in order to maintain it. So it's a really nice capability that Microsoft provides, and it has two tiers. It has a free tier and it has a standard tier, and the free tier has some limitations, but for many use cases, it's actually a pretty good option for you to use. And it doesn't really cost you anything at that point. It also provides you with the ability to use it for feature flagging, which is another useful option, but we're not going to get into that today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to actually get it deployed, as well as how to build a function app that can run both on Windows and Linux, and it doesn't require you to have any code changes. So let's go ahead and get started. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and create two different resource groups, because in order for you to be able to have a Windows and a Linux function app or an app service, you can't actually put them in the same resource group as of today. Maybe Microsoft will change that in the future. Now, you can do that if you actually run it in containers, but that's a different topic for another day. So I'm going to go ahead and actually deploy two new resource groups, and what I'm going to call them is Cloud Developer, Func, Win, and RSG for resource group, and I'm going to deploy it in the East US region. Go ahead and review and create, and quickly I'm going to go ahead and deploy another one and call it Cloud Developer, Func, Win, RSG, and go ahead and create that as well. So they get created pretty quickly. So, and the next step is we're going to go ahead and deploy the actual function app itself, because it's going to take a little bit of time, and then we'll go ahead and deploy and configure the app configuration service itself. So I'll go ahead and go into the Linux resource group, and when you click add, the function app option becomes available right on the main screen. So I'll go ahead and choose that. And then here I'm going to give it a name. So I'll call it Cloud Developer Func Lin 1, and you can give it different names based on how you want to name your applications and function apps. And I'm going to put it in the East US region here. So the next option I'm going to choose is which storage account I want to tie this function app, specifically the hosting plan, to. And since I don't have one in the current resource group, I'm going to go ahead and create one, and I'll call it Cloud Developer Lin Storage. And there's actually a limitation on how many characters you can use, so you'll get an error message if you actually go with a too long of a name. I'll go ahead and click OK here. And then since this is a Linux resource group, I'm going to choose Linux here, and I'm going to stay with consumption, serverless basically. Click on monitoring, and I already have an App Insights instance deployed, and I'm just going to attach it to that. Go to tags and then review, and go ahead and click create here. So, and as this is actually deploying, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my subscription again, go to the resource groups and into the Windows one, and in here I'm going to actually deploy two different function apps, and I'll show you why, because there's an error that I would like you to be aware of in case you misconfigure the settings during the deployment and the building of your function app. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it Cloud Developer Func Win, Win Function 1. I'll copy the name here. I'll choose the .NET Core stack, and again, I'll pick East US here. Go to hosting, create another storage account, and then here I'm going to call it Cloud Developer Storage, and actually I'll call it Win Storage, just so we can tell easier later. And this is going to be a Windows one, and I'll keep the same options, and then I'll pick the same App Insights instance that I already have deployed, and then review, and let's go ahead and create this one. And then as soon as this starts off, I'm going to go ahead and again deploy a second function app so I can show you that error that you might get. So, and then let's go ahead and create function 2. Pick .NET Core, East US, and since we already have a storage account that's actually being set up right now, I'm going to go ahead and choose that. Monitoring, I'll choose App Insights, review and create, and let's go ahead and click create here. So now it's creating all of the function apps for us. So I'll go back to my Linux resource group here, and at this point I'm going to go ahead and set up the app configuration service itself. So let's go ahead and search for app configuration, and choose that. And for the name, I'm just going to go ahead and call it Cloud Developer Settings. And in here, as I mentioned, there are 2 different tiers. I'm going to go ahead and choose the free tier. And then you can click on this link here and it will actually show you the details for the pricing of this. So I'll click Next, Review and Create, and go ahead and start actually deploying it. So while this is actually going through the deployment process, we're going to again go back to the resource groups and go into the Windows resource group for now, since it's actually finishing the deployment of both of those functions. And what I'm going to do is, for the first one, I'm going to set up what's called a managed identity. This is how we're actually going to configure our function to allow it access to the app configuration service itself. So, and the way you do that is through assigning a specific role for your function app to have inside of the app configuration service. So, and in order to do that, you have to actually generate an identity here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this identity blade here, and under system assigned, I'm going to go ahead and choose the on status and click save. And it's going to say that basically once it's registered, you can actually give it access to other resources. And it's asking me if I want to do that, and I'm going to go ahead and say yes. And it's going to take a second, and then we'll proceed to the next step. So you can see that it finished, and then so now the next step would be is let's go back to the subscription again and go to the Linux resource group. And under the Linux resource group, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to actually go and give it an identity as well. Click save and give it another couple of seconds, and it's complete. So one thing to note is once we actually give it the identities to the function apps and configure the identities to have access to the actual app configuration service, it can take a couple of minutes actually for the settings to be granted in the back end of the Azure system itself, the platform. And vice versa, actually, if you take away the permissions, it can actually take a few minutes as well in order for those cache permissions to disappear. So it's not an immediate change that takes place right away after you actually remove the permissions. It's something for you to be aware of in case there's a security event that happens. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Cloud Developer Settings App Configuration Service instance. And under the access control, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on add a role assignment. Under the role assignment, I'm going to choose App Configuration Data Reader, because the only thing I really care about is allowing my function apps to actually be able to read the settings. I don't want the function app to be able to modify the settings themselves. And then under the assign access to, I'm going to choose function app, and you'll see that both of those function apps where I enabled the identity actually show up under this list. So I'll go ahead and choose both of them, click save, and this role assignment is actually going to be created, and you'll see it show up right here. So now that we're ready, the next step is essentially us adding some configurations in the actual app settings themselves into the app configuration instance. So I'll go ahead and click on this Configuration Explorer, and under the Create option here, I'm going to go ahead and choose Key Value, and then I'll call the first one Message, and this is what we're actually going to display as the response from within our function app by reading that value out of this app configuration instance. So, and I'll just make the message welcome from our function app. And then I'm not going to give it a label or any content type. I'll just hit apply. The next setting I'm going to create is going to be just called app setting 1. And I'll give it a value of 1. And this time I'm going to actually give it a label, and this is going to be label 1. Come on. And then hit apply. And you'll notice that it created that app setting with label 1. And then another one is I'm going to create an app setting 2. Give it a value of 2. And I'm going to create a label 2. And you'll see how this actually works once we actually start writing the code. So now you can also click on show value, and you'll see all the different values. So one thing to be careful about is this is really meant for storing non-sensitive information. And if you did want to store sensitive information, what you could do is you can click create a Key Vault reference. And then if you have a Key Vault instance, you can actually link Azure App Configuration directly to your Key Vault, and that's where you can actually store sensitive information. But you can still leverage the App Configuration API to retrieve the values. And there are additional steps that I can cover in other videos where I can show you how to actually do that. So if you're interested, leave a comment in the comment section below, and I can record another video to show you how to do that. So now that we actually have this configured, the next step would be is to actually go ahead and start working on our function app. And what we'll also need to do is we'll need to go to this access keys tab here, and we'll need to get some values out of here when we're actually setting up our function app. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio Community Edition, and then I'm going to go ahead and click Create New Project. And here I'm going to actually choose Azure Function as the project type. So, and this is something that you'll need to make sure you have installed as a template to be able to actually do this. So I'm going to go ahead and call it Cloud Developer Settings, and it's going to put it in my D drive projects file. And then I'll go ahead and click Create. And in here, since I'm not actually doing anything special, or this is basically just displaying a message by reading the value out of the app configuration, I don't need anything from a storage account essentially. And just for the purposes of showing you how to write the code to access app configuration, I'm going to make it triggerable by an HTTP trigger. So basically in a browser, we can go to a particular URL, and is going to be able to give us the message, the response message. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to keep it at authorization level for the given function. So this way it's a secure call. So it's not open to the internet, and anybody without a particular key can just simply call and abuse my service. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create, and it's going to create me a new project. So it's going to take a few seconds here. Okay, so now that the project has been created, we're going to do a handful of things here. So the first thing what we're going to do here is let's actually rename the actual function here, and we'll call it read message or read settings. And it's asking me if we want to rename the actual class itself, and we're going to say yes. And then for the function itself, let's call it get message. And then we'll also call the function itself, not just the name of it. And for the purposes of this particular tutorial, all we care about is just being able to make a get HTTP call. We don't care about everything else. So let's go ahead and actually do a quick test to make sure that this function app starts up without any issues. And what you'll see here is it's going to give us a URL that we can navigate to. So in here, all you have to do is basically copy this particular URL. Let's go to the browser, open up a new tab, and then navigate to it. Now, in here, basically this is the response that is coded into the current function itself. And you can actually see that if you add a query parameter of name and whatever you want it to be called, so let's call it Cloud Developer, press enter, it will actually return back hello Cloud Developer or whatever you put in as the actual query string parameter here. So we see that this function is currently fully functional. So let's go ahead and stop it and actually write some code. So in order to get this working, what we're going to want to do is let's just actually format a message real quick. So our response message equals testing, just so we can actually get it to compile without all the extra code that is listed. So we're going to need a few different things. One is we're going to need to make it easier for us to consume the configuration itself within a function. We don't want to have to write a new way of consuming the app configuration service every single time that we want to add another one of these type of functions themselves. So, and the way to do that is there's a way to be able to use dependency injection with your function apps, as I believe of version v3 of function apps. Maybe it was available before, but it is fully baked in now in version 3. And I'll show you how to use that. So we'll need a Nuget package for that. We'll also need a way to be able to access the actual app configuration itself, which requires an identity when we're actually running in Azure inside of the cloud itself, platform. And then we also need a way to be able to consume that same app configuration when we're locally developing on our computer. So I'll show you a little trick that works for both without any additional code changes needed. And it's also cross-platform compatible, which makes it very easy and nice to write code. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to add 3 different Nuget packages. So I'm going to right click on the project and manage Nuget packages. I'll go to browse, and the first one is going to be the Azure App Configuration. So let's look for that, and it's this option right here. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this down arrow, and it's going to prompt me. I'll go ahead and accept. And this is basically installing all the Nuget packages and all of its dependencies. The next option I'm going to go for is the Azure Identity. And this is needed for the authentication piece. I'm going to go ahead and click the arrow again, click OK, and accept. And it's going to install that. And then another package that we want to download here, this is for dependency injection, and this is this functions extensions Nuget package. And this is going to allow us to use dependency injection in order to be able to simplify our configuration management process. So with these 3 packages added now, the next step would be is to actually write some code that's going to allow us to actually consume the configuration. So register the actual service instance and then consume it. And the way to do that is we're going to add a new class. And in this particular class, we're going to actually write the code for the startup process in order to be able to add the service instance into the dependency injection service. So we'll call it startup, and then we'll make it public. And then we're going to have to tell this function app itself that we want to use this class as the startup class. So the way you do that is by adding an assembly attribute and then function startup. And then we'll give it a type that we wanted to use for startup. So it's going to be cloud developer settings as a namespace, and then choose this particular class type. And then we're going to want to inherit from function startup. And as soon as you do that, it is going to prompt you to go ahead and implement the abstract method here. So this is called the configure method. And what one thing that you're going to want to make sure that you do as part of this, when the function actually starts up, it's actually the default behavior of it is it's going to override the actual settings that you get. So what we're going to do is we're going to write some code to actually preserve those particular providers for the app settings by writing some code, and then add some configuration logic in order to authenticate to the app configuration service itself. So we're going to go ahead and start off with building a new list of providers, and we'll call the parameter, the argument, the variable providers. It's going to be a list of a configuration provider. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get a reference to all of the different services that we have access to. So we'll get an iService collection. Call it services, and then we're going to get it from builder services. And then the next step would be is we're going to filter all the different services where the interface that they implement is configuration. So we'll do this by doing services.where, and then we're going to say descriptor, and the descriptor type is going to be iConfiguration. Okay. Now we're going to do a to list so we can actually iterate over it. And then inside of this, what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if it implements the iConfiguration root interface. And then if it doesn't, then basically we're going to not do anything with this. We're just going to return out of this function. So and then if it does, then we're going to go ahead and add it and preserve this particular provider or set of providers in our collection or the list that we just created before. So, and we're going to add the range and then descriptor dot providers, oops, not descriptor, existing config. And then what we're going to do is remove the actual descriptor from the services list. Okay, so the next step would be is we actually need to, in order to be able to actually understand which app configuration service to connect to, we are going to add a configuration file, but the only responsibility that file has is to point us to the actual app configuration service URL itself. And in the particular case of it running, the function app itself running in Azure, it's only going to have a reference to the fully qualified URL of that app service. But in the case of a local development environment, it's actually going to use a connection string. And the way that we're going to achieve that is we're going to have a configuration file. One is called app settings.json, which is a normal way that you would do in any ASP.NET application. And then we're going to use the local.settings.json file to actually point it to the connection string, which is going to be used for local development. Now, this local settings JSON file is never going to be actually deployed into Azure. So this is a more secure way of you doing development locally and not exposing any secrets in your settings files. So in order to do that, one of the things we have to actually consider is writing code to know that if you're doing the execution locally, which files to pull the values from. So, and the way to do that would be is we first need to actually understand where the code is executing so that we can actually reference the app settings files from. So, and one way to do that would be is to ask the current execution context options service in order to see what's the folder that we can actually use. So, and the way we do that is we can call a services build service provider get service method in order to get that information. So let's create a variable called execution context options services build service provider, and then we'll say get service of type options, and the type is going to be execution context options, and we'll get the value. And then the next step is we're going to actually create a configuration builder object, and we're going to configure it to be aware of the settings files. So we'll call this variable config, and it's going to be of type new configuration builder. And then we're going to say set, let's see, not binder, builder. And we're going to say set base path. And then we're going to say execution context options, app directory, and then add JSON file. The first file we're actually going to reference is app settings.json. Now this file doesn't exist, we'll create it right after this. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to say optional false. So we want to make sure that this file does exist, because otherwise we won't know which app configuration service to actually use. And then reload on change, we're going to want to say true. And then we'll also add the JSON file of local settings JSON, and then optional true, because if it doesn't exist, especially in Azure, we don't really care. And we're also going to say go ahead and reload it on changes. And let's fix this spelling mistake right here. And we're almost done. So the next step is we're going to want to actually make some additional calls in order to actually get the app configuration service registered. So we'll do this by adding or creating a new method. We'll call it setup app configuration provider. And then we'll pass in the config builder itself into it. And then we'll create this one in a second. Let's complete this function itself. And the last two steps that we need to do is we just need to call the providers add range. And then we're going to say config.build and then providers. Basically what this is doing is it's taking this configuration builder and all of the different settings that we just configured here, and they're going to be added to the providers, and then we're going to register a singleton instance, a class that is configuration root, so that dependency injection can actually inject it into our function instances themselves, into the functions themselves. So, and the last step would be a services add singleton of configuration. And then we're going to say new configuration root, and then we're going to say providers. So this should allow us to now, when we actually finish writing the code, when our functions actually start up, it will know to use this instance of configuration root and give it to providers that were registered in this particular method. and or retained through the logic we just written right here. So let's go ahead and create this method here that's missing. And then let's change this argument here to config builder. And in here, what we're going to do is we're actually going to write some code in order to actually pull out the values from our app settings files in order to know how to connect. So the way we'll do this is we'll create a new config variable, and what we're going to do is we're going to say config builder.build. This is actually going to allow us to get access to the files themselves and the values inside of this app settings or the local settings file itself. And then the next step would be is I mentioned the usage of labels, and one of the options that we're going to actually use is the filtering logic inside of the app configuration service, and I'll show you how to do that. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to have a pipe delimited list of filter options, one for the name of settings, the other one is for the name of labels. So, and we'll call this config keys. And then what how you can access them now, since we actually have built and referenced these files here, and we call build, we can actually just simply reference config, open up the square brackets, and then you can use the normal app configuration notation to be able to access settings. So, and the way to do that is I'm going to call the settings inside of an app config node, and then the actual key name for the config keys is going to be config keys. And then I'm going to actually make sure that if it's nullable, that it doesn't blow up on me by using this question mark method, and then I'll split the value by using a pipe here. So, and then we'll use this within our next couple of calls. So the other setting that we're going to need to use is the actual endpoint. So whether we connect through the connection string or the actual endpoint, which is going to be the fully qualified name of the actual app configuration service. So we'll call this variable endpoint. And then we're going to write another method. It's going to be called isDevelopmentEnvironment. And then we'll see if this is running inside of a development environment, we're going to try to get one value, and then if it's not, then we're going to get another value. And they will come from two different files by writing code this way. So if we're running in a development environment, we're going to want to reference the app config connection string. And you can name these however you want to use them. This is just the way I'm choosing to do that here, or name them in my case. So, and the other one is if we're running in Azure itself, we're gonna call the setting name app config, and we're gonna call it endpoint. So basically, this is gonna store one or the other value inside of this endpoint variable itself. And then the next step would be is let's actually go ahead and call config builder and now register the actual app configuration provider. So, and the way you do that is by calling add Azure App Configuration, and we'll call this argument here OPT for options. And then what we're going to do is, again, we're going to actually, depending on if we're running in a development environment, then we're going to connect one way. If we're running in Azure, we're going to connect in a different way. Now we're actually going to be consuming the value of the endpoint. And this is just so we can reduce how we write the code, so we don't have to actually do a bunch of if-else statements and whatnot. So I'm using this discard way of actually writing the code here, and then we're gonna again use that method that we haven't created yet. We'll create it in a second. And then basically, if we're in a development environment, what we're gonna do is we're gonna say opt connect, and then we'll just pass it the endpoint. But if we're running in Azure, we're gonna say opt connect, and then there's a overload method here, and this overload method takes in a URI and a particular token credential. And this is where we're going to be able to use the Azure Identity class called default Azure credential to be able to actually retrieve the identity that we set up before, and it's going to automatically pass it in. This way you don't have to manage the secrets, the passwords, the rotation of them. This is a really handy way of actually maintaining security in your Azure space. So we're going to say new URI, give it endpoint, and then we're going to say new default Azure credential. And that's pretty much it in terms of how you connect. Now, the last aspect is we're going to want to actually configure the filters that I mentioned before. And the way to do that would be is we'll say config keys to list for each. Let's see. And what we're going to do here is we're going to actually split each configuration key, because remember there's filtering that you can do based on the app setting name, or in addition to it you can actually also filter based on the label. So, and I'll show you examples of both. So in here what we're going to do is we're going to split the key by a comma. So, and the way to do that would be is config key split comma, and then what we're going to do is we're going to make a call to see basically if we have if we actually do have both key and label filtering specified, then we're going to check to see if the key length that we just split, this is an array, if it's greater than 1, that means that we do have both the key and the label filter. If not, we're just going to assume it's going to be a key filter. So and the way to do that would be is we'll call the opt select, and then we'll say key 0 for the first index, and then key 1 for the second one, and then we'll say opt select, and then we'll just say key 0. So basically if it's greater than 1, then we're going to pass in both filters. If it's not, then it's going to only use the first one. So this method has been fully created, and the only remaining piece here would be is to actually create this is development environment. And the way to do that is essentially there is an environment variable that Azure Functions hosting environment creates for you by default. And what we're going to do is it only exists in your local development environment. So we'll do a check to see if it exists, then we'll assume it's a development environment. If it doesn't exist, we assume it's in Azure. And the way to do that would be is you simply do a check to see if that environment variable exists by checking for the value by doing a equals check. So, and then we'll say environment, get environment variable, and it's called Azure Functions environment. And then we just want to make sure it doesn't basically it does a case insensitive comparison. So, and this should do it. So let's go ahead and compile this project, and it should not return any errors for us. And it succeeded. Now a couple of more things that we have to do is to actually add some code in order to be able to use the dependency injection, and also remember that we have to actually configure the actual app settings file itself. So let's go ahead and configure the dependency injection first. And what we'll do is we'll go back to the read settings class itself, and since we're using dependency injection, we can go ahead and remove the static from the class, and we'll remove static from the actual function itself, or the method. And then we're going to want to create a constructor, and inside of a constructor we're going to put in iConfiguration and call the actual argument configuration. And let's go ahead and do a argument null check. And if it is, we're going to throw a null argument exception. Okay, and then if it's not, then what's going to happen is we're going to take and store the value in a property that's going to be a read-only property. And the way I like to do it, this is a preference, is by simply creating a read-only property here. And we'll just click this option here, and we're going to remove the public accessor, and I'm just going to put it at the top of my class here. Okay, so now this will make it available for me to consume now. So let's go ahead and actually get the value of that message setting that we configured in our app configuration service. And the way to do that would be is by simply referencing the configuration, and then we'll call it message, because that's the actual name of the key that we created. And it's going to be able to return that value for us. Now, the other thing that you can do, and we can show that here, is app setting 1. If you remember that we actually created app setting 1 and app setting 2, and I'm going to show you how to create the filters where only 2 of the settings are actually going to be returned. The third setting is going to remain in app configuration, and we're not going to use it. So now, we're not going to actually output the value of app setting 1. We're just going to return the response message. It's going to contain the value of the message setting itself. So we also noticed that there is this warning, and basically this warning is basically telling us that because we're using async, but we're not using async anywhere internally, it's not a good practice to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to say return await task from result, and we just basically used an await here, and it satisfied this particular checker. So now the code is complete. Now, in order for it to be functional, we have to do the remaining step of configuring the actual connections and references to our app settings file. So the way to do that would be is let's go ahead and add a new file by going to add new item. We'll search for JSON and use this JSON configuration file, and we'll call this app settings JSON. And then let's go ahead and actually replace this. If you remember, I called it app config. And then internally, inside of this app config node, for the app settings itself, we're going to want to call it endpoint. And this is where we're going to reference the actual name of the app service itself, app configuration service. But also, we're going to want to reference the config keys. And this is where the filtering is going to happen. And the first filter we're going to do is star. This will allow us to actually select all of the different settings. And then the other option I'm going to select here is app setting. And I'll do a star using a wildcard. So basically what this is going to allow me to do is, if I don't specify anything else, it's going to return both app setting 1 and 2. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit it to just return 1. And I'll do that by doing test 1. And then I won't use any wildcards. Now, this is because in our app configuration itself, let's go back here real quick. You'll see that label, actually label 1 and label 2. So let's go ahead and fix that. So label 1. And so this app setting file has been created. Now, another important step for this is we're actually going to want to go to properties of this app settings file itself and make sure it's actually copied to the output directory. And we'll just set it, copy it if it's newer. And the reason this is important is you want to make sure this file actually gets deployed with your application code itself. Now, another piece that we're going to want to do is for the local development environment experience, we're going to go to the local.settings JSON file, and we're going to add the app config node here. And we're going to create a new app setting here. It's called connection string. And this is where we're going to reference the actual full connection string. Now, the reason why you don't want to deploy this to your actual Azure service is because it has sensitive information. So in the access keys blade of the app configuration service itself, this connection string actually has the key, the secret of how to connect to your app configuration service. I'm going to go ahead and copy this and put this directly into this file here. And as you can see, it's actually referencing my configuration service. It uses an ID, and it actually gives us the actual secret. So you don't want to expose that information to others who might have potential access to your function app itself. And don't bother trying to hit it, because I'm going to actually delete this particular app configuration instance after this video. So, and what we're going to want to do is, inside of our app settings file, we're going to want to put the fully qualified name of our app configuration here. So I'm going to go back, and actually one thing that I just missed real quick is there is the read write key, and then there's read only key. So the value I actually copied before was a read write key. So we're going to want to fix that real quick. So let's go ahead and finish configuration of the endpoint value here, and we'll go back to the app settings. Oops, sorry, the local settings. And I'm going to copy the connection string, just so it's actually a connection string for being able to read only, not read and write. So we can go ahead and close this, and now we're ready to actually get it tested. So let's set a breakpoint real quick, and I'll also show you the behavior that you see here. So I'm going to put a breakpoint right here, and also put a breakpoint right here. Let's go ahead and run it. And as you can see, before we actually saw where it gave us the URL, but because we're now switching over to using dependency injection on the startup of the actual host for this function app, it's actually going to go ahead and run this particular startup class before the actual function itself becomes available. And this is where it's actually going to be registering the app configuration provider, and we'll be able to step through it real quick. So you can see here that the config keys actually got read, and we'll see the star and app setting star and label. The endpoint, it actually queried to see if we actually are running locally in a development environment. And if it is, then it's going to give us a connection string. And if I hover over this, you can see that it has the full connection string to the app configuration service itself. And then if we go ahead and step over that and come back here, one important thing to note, the sequence of how I've written this code here is really important, because when the call to config.build actually gets executed, this is where this particular piece of code right here is actually going to get executed. So I've had a situation where depending on, well, how I originally wrote the code, it actually went into overflow, Stack Overflow, because it kept running or calling the code on itself. So you want to be really careful when you do that. So let's go ahead and actually step through that. So here you can see that we only have one filter, which is star, and it's going to go through, and it's going to go again for the second one, and here it has two. So it's going to apply a different or make a call to apply a filter based on filter and label, or key and label. And then it's going to exit out and register the instance, and off it goes. So now the function is available, and we can actually call it. So let's go ahead, go to the browser. We already had it open, so let's just simply go ahead and refresh. And it actually comes into the message method itself. And what you'll see here is the response message. So as you can see, it actually read the value directly from the app configuration service. and let's see what happens here. And you can see that app setting also was red. So everything that we expected to work is working perfectly. So one other thing that I can show you real quick is there are 3 different providers here. 2 are the files, and the other one is the app configuration provider. And you'll notice here that the data that came back is there's only message and app setting. The app setting 2 got filtered out. So if I go ahead and change my app configuration or app settings JSON file and change the config keys, it can be changed in such a way where it can return all the values if you wanted to. But we don't need to show that here, and let's go ahead and run it. So you can see that it ran successfully. If I refresh, everything is working perfectly. So the last step of this process is for us to actually get this deployed and see it working in Azure. And the way to do that is by simply right-clicking and going to Publish. And in here, I didn't have to click anything else because it didn't have a published profile. It's going to give me an option right away. Where do I want to publish it? And we're going to start off with a Linux one. Oddly enough, it takes a little longer to actually make the function app appear in Linux function apps than it is in Windows, so we'll start there. And then also notice that it only returned me a resource group with a function app for Linux. So just something interesting that I observed. And then the other option that I like to choose here is to always basically remove the additional files in case somebody actually added stuff there. I want to make sure that my source always basically overrides all of the settings that exist in the destination. This way that I'm always making sure that what I have in my source control is always the source of truth, not what's actually deployed. So I'll go ahead and save this, and then I'm going to go ahead and click Publish so that it starts actually executing the publish command into the cloud. So one other observation that I've made is sometimes I actually need to do the publishing twice or 3 times before I actually see the function app show up, or the function itself show up in the Azure portal. So let's see if we're going to need to do that here as well. But let's let this one finish, and then while it's actually waiting for the function app to start up, I'm going to go ahead and create a new publish profile, and in this case I'm going to select Windows and deploy to the Windows function app. So we'll deploy it to the function 1, click finish, and again we're going to make sure that additional files are actually not stored or overwritten. And then we're going to go ahead and publish here. And a third thing I'm going to do here is I'm also going to deploy to the function 2 instance. And if you remember, I did not actually set up the identity for function 2 in order to have access to the app configuration. And I wanted to show you the behavior of what you might run into. It's not easy to show you because of that caching implementation that they have. If I try to disable it during this video, because it sometimes takes 5-10 minutes or so for it to actually refresh the cache, but deploying it to a new instance will actually allow me to show you much quicker. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this same code to the second function app here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to the portal and actually make sure that we can actually run the code itself and see the same exact behavior, but running in Azure versus running on the local development environment. So this is deploying now. This is the last function app instance that I'm actually going to be deploying. And then once it finishes, we're going to go to the portal. Okay, so this is done. And let's go ahead and actually go to the Linux instance and see to see if that method actually shows up here. So we'll click on the function app, and under the functions, as you can see, it actually didn't show up still. So let me do this. I'm going to go ahead and actually just deploy it once more. As I mentioned before, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 times for me to try to publish for it to actually show up properly. And this should finish the deployment pretty quickly. But we'll actually give it a few more seconds, and we'll take a look at the Windows Function 1. Most likely it already is showing the actual function itself. So let's go back to the subscription, go to the Windows Function 1, go to Functions, and what do you know, it still doesn't show here. Let's see if we can actually bounce around between the different instances and if it actually ends up showing us. Okay, so the first one showed up. Let's go ahead and click on it, and by going to this code and test, there's a way for us to retrieve the URL that has the specific key that is set up for this particular function, so we can call it in a secure way. So we're going to go ahead and paste that URL here in a new tab, press enter, and as you can see, the actual message from app configuration came back. So this is a fully functional .NET Core function app method that actually use the identity of the function itself to make a call to app configuration to retrieve the setting itself. So, which is pretty cool. So then what we're going to want to do is, let me try to show you what you might see if you don't properly set up the identity for access. So we actually deployed the function itself. Let's see if the function method shows up. It's not here yet. Oh, there you go. So as you can see right here, it actually failed because there is no identity set up. So, and in the past, I've actually seen a slightly different message. It was actually giving me a 403 because it was trying to actually make a call to the app configuration service. And if I try to execute this method here, or this function itself, it's actually gonna fail. So let's try that. So as you can see, this is the message you're gonna get. Function host is not running. And within a few seconds, or I guess 10, 20, 30 seconds or so, you'll eventually end up seeing that this function itself ends up stopping. And the reason why it's going to end up stopping is because the actual function host itself, the main application code, can't actually finish dependency injection execution, and thus it actually fails to start up, period. So I just hit stop and start, and let's see if we see any behavioral differences here. Okay, so this is a slightly different message that I see here. It's trying to actually access an extension for the identity service, and because it actually doesn't have an identity set up, that's why it fails. So this is actually slightly different in that that's because I didn't actually enable the identity. Now let's actually go ahead and set up an identity here and give it a moment to understand. So the way this works is the default Azure credential will actually make a local API call within the actual hosting environment to try to retrieve the bearer token that it can then use to make a call to the app configuration service. But because I didn't have that configured, that's why it actually showed up like that. So I just enabled that identity. Let's go ahead and stop it, and we'll start it again and see if we can actually see that 403 message, which is basically gonna tell us that we didn't have the proper RBAC set up in the app configuration service. So this might take a few more seconds or so for it to start showing us the proper message. Let's go back to the Linux one and actually see if the function showed up now. There you go. Okay, so this is a Linux instance running with the same exact code. And let's go ahead and copy that URL. Press enter, and as you can see, it's also fully functional. So pretty quick implementation, I would say, and very robust. So let's see if our second function actually will show us that other message. There we go. So this is the message you will get if you have your identity set up, but you did not grant that identity access to your app configuration. So this took me a little bit to figure out how to get it working, and the fact that I initially thought that I was doing something wrong, where really it was just a missing configuration in the app configuration service itself. So if I go into the actual Linux resource group and go to the app configuration, access control, and then I'll add the role here, again a data reader, and then I'll choose function app, and I'll choose the function 2 and save. After a few minutes, this issue will get resolved. Now, one of the things that you're going to probably want to do is in your function app itself, in this case, this was the second function app, you're going to want to stop it and start it a few times until this error message goes away. But I'm not really sure what the actual caching duration is for when it actually checks. But it can, I've seen it take 5 to 10 minutes for enabling or even disabling. So you just want to be mindful and be aware of this message. So hopefully this was really useful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to leave your comments in the comments section, and I'll try to get to them as quickly as possible. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.